Hello, welcome back to the MCAT grind. We have Biology Chapter 12, Genetics and Evolution. This is the final chapter about biology. Now, genetics evolution is pretty straightforward in terms of concepts, and you just need to remember a few things. We have the dominance, which in regards to alleles, if one is dominant to another, we say that it's because one allele is just sufficient to result in the resulting phenotype. So that's basic dominance. So if we have one allele that's R and another one is a small r, and just having this set, the big R, which associated with the red phenotype, then just one is sufficient, then the big R is dominant to the small r allele. Co-dominance is when the heterozygous shows that both R phenotype and a small r phenotype shows. So having a big R and a small r shows a resulting red and white flower. And the white is associated with the homozygous small r genotype. Incomplete dominance is when the heterozygous big R and small r show an intermediate between the phenotypes of each respective homozygotes. So big R and small r shows a pink, which is an intermediate between the red and white phenotype. Penetrance is describing the percentage of population with that specific genotype as shows the phenotype. For instance, if a population has the RR genotype, and that's a mutant genotype, for example, and so what's the penetrance is measuring how much of the population, the percent, that actually shows that resulting trait. Some may be masked, maybe that's not enough to produce that actual product. So we want to measure how much it actually penetrates the population that's being infected or has that genotype. Expressivity is how much, to what extent is that genotype expressed into the phenotype. So perhaps certain people with this disease shows complete blindness and cataracts, but for instance, some others just get hives and itches, right? So it could be a variable expressivity, or it could be something like just a cold and everyone express the same show the same resulting phenotype from the genotype expression. All right, next we have the Mendel law of genetics. The first law is segregation, stating how genetics can diversify by two sets of genes being split due to the meiosis splitting the alleles. So by separating the chromosomes from each other, right, and the chromatids from each other, also the homologous pairs, it produces like different sets of alleles into the different haploids. We also, the second law of independent assortment. Basically, genes are crossed over during metaphase, right? They're lined at the border, and the homologous pairs in meiosis 1, they will exchange at the chiasmata and form recombination. So some of the genes will be switched to other, and those would be completely different from the parent homologs, either parent homologs. We also have test cross, which shows we can look using a Punnett square to determine what the mysterious genotype is. So if we don't know what this is, but we test it against a recessive genotype, and we look at the result, see if it's 50% of each resulting phenotype, then and we know that this big B is dominant to the other one must be a small b to form this specific pattern. If it's 100% the result of the big B pattern, then we know the other one must be big B. In Hardy-Weinert principles, in regards to population, we know that the genotype frequency, allele frequency of P plus the allele frequency of Q in a dual allele at a gene, it should add up to equal 1 for frequency. And because we are in a Punnett square and crossing them to each other, the end result should be p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1 as well. And this only effectively works under equilibrium, where there's large population, no mutation, random mating, no migration, and equal fitness for every genotype that passes on the trait. Now, this is very unrealistic because there will always be some kind of restriction to this, but this is the equivalent of saying no friction and ignore air resistance in like physics problems. Okay, so it's more for just theoretically. And we have Darwin's evolution theories. So Darwin's original evolution theory is that few offsprings survive from the parents, and there are certain survival advantage to random traits taken up by the offsprings. And some of those traits, if they increase the fitness of reproduction, then they go on to reproduce better, right, and produce more viable offsprings. Now, with the neo-Darwinism, they basically added a new tenet saying that it's not only the individual level, but a population level where it has an inclusive fitness. So that's why altruism kind of exists, because you think we could benefit each other as a whole. And you could help your parents or you could help your family members, because if they go ahead and successfully do well, then that also helps your genes being passed on in a sense. All right? And that could also be why racism is a thing, where you want to inclusively help people who look more like you, like look more similar to you, to preserve your group's fitness. Next, we have selection. If we were to look at this graph showing the number of individuals versus the phenotype, and phenotype could be going this way or the other way, different ends of the spectrum. In the middle, if it's an equilibrium, it could shift into a stabilizing selection, where too far off to the ends would be bad, so eventually it wants to thin out that narrow range, right? Being in a narrow range fares much better in a selection. Directional selection, let's say they're starting to go with the demand for food is greater than ever, so there's less food going around. The individuals who are lower weight class could benefit better, so they shift to this way, right? So basically shifts towards one end of the spectrum as a population. Disruptive selection, when there's something that destroys the equal ground, the middle ground. For example, if there are black trees and white trees around for a spider to move around and hide in, a gray spider will be very easily seen on the trees and get eaten. So you can only have black or white spiders of that species. We also have evolutionary patterns in the lineages. In an ancestral population, it could diverge into two lineages because of a certain happening. For example, a geographical change, a sudden earthquake, or any natural disaster, or they're segregated because one reason or another, migration. Yeah, and that result speciation and turn into like two different populations of species. We also have parallel speciation, where they grow along side by side, sharing similar traits, right? But they're effectively different species because they cannot reproduce together and make viable offsprings that reproduce and make like offsprings themselves. Convergent evolution is when two distinct lineages goes ahead and show similar traits together, like how bats and birds from different lineages, they achieve flight in a similar trait. All right, that's pretty much it.